The American story is filled with successes and failures. 2.5 centuries of history forged in times of war and peace. But despite the complexities implicit in examining history, there are few cases that are genuinely black and white. The typical explanations for the use of nuclear force against Japan argue that it falls into a moral gray area, a lesser of two evils meant to end World War II as soon as possible. Sadly, the truth is far less nuanced. The bombings became the strongest example of America's utter disregard for peaceful diplomacy. In August 1945, the U.S. looked for a way to justify the expense of the Manhattan Project, and committed a mass atrocity in the quest for international intimidation. Despite the commonly accepted notion that the nuclear annihilation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was an unfortunate but justified conclusion to the Second World War, in reality it was an unparalleled show of unnecessary force, and truly a diplomatic failure that remains one of the worst atrocities the world has ever seen. Before the war, President Roosevelt received a letter signed by top scientists urging him to consider the possibility that Hitler could be developing weapons harnessing nuclear fission. The Uranium Committee was formed, and on August 13, 1942, the Manhattan Project officially began. Adjusted for inflation, the project cost more than $30 billion. 130,000 people worked on various parts. However, only a tiny handful actually understood the final goal. It was so secretive that then-President Truman was only briefed on the project on April 24th, 12 days after Roosevelt died and Truman took office. As the war dragged on, intelligence increasingly indicated that the Nazis would never complete a nuclear bomb. Their natural resources and manufacturing had been stretched to the brink, and their greatest scientific minds already fled to the U.S. If the bombs were not used, the hard-kept secrecy and tens of billions of dollars used to develop the Manhattan Project and their myopic vision would have been wasted. Furthermore, the intense secrecy stifled the opportunity for any debate around the bomb. America alone comprehended the practical power of nuclear fission. The United States needed a return on investment, and after the devastating success of the Trinity test in July, wiping Hiroshima from the map presented itself as an alluring option. One of the most overlooked points about the bombings is their highly questionable strategic value. Perhaps one of the grossest over-exaggerations in American history came when Truman announced the destruction.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base.
However, we know Hiroshima had a bustling civilian population, and while there were soldiers and military equipment in the city, less than 10% of those killed were soldiers. When looked at logically, a sinister idea emerges. Many claim Hiroshima's military presence was enough to justify the weapon. However, massive American air raids occurred all summer, with many cities completely flattened. If Hiroshima had enough of a significant military presence to have bearing on the war, why wasn't it destroyed earlier? The fact is, the military presence was negligible, and Hiroshima's untouched state was no coincidence. On May 12th, specifications were made for the first use. A report delivered to Leslie Groves, the leader of the Manhattan Project, stated that, quote, obtaining the greatest psychological effect and making the initial use sufficiently spectacular to be internationally recognized was of utmost importance. In the same meeting, they specifically resolved not to drop the bomb on a military target, in case a failed detonation allowed the enemy to recover it. Even Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, agreed in a 1963 interview that the attack lacked military necessity. Eisenhower, the single most aware person on the planet of Allied strategy, said, quote, the Japanese were ready to surrender, and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. Although we forewent diplomatic actions and continued bombing Japan, their surrender was ultimately not due to American bombs at all. What truly forced the Japanese surrender was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria on August 9th. The dominant notion in the narrative is that Japan's stubbornness forced us into using the bomb. The argument typically goes that the United States had to prepare for an invasion unlike any other, the amphibious assault on the Japanese homeland. This is certainly true. While 12 divisions landed in D-Day's initial stages, Operation Downfall called for 45. Some estimates put U.S. casualties alone at upwards of 5 million, attempting to prove that the atom bomb was simply the lesser of two evils. However, the inherent assumption that Japan would never surrender is completely fabricated. In fact, Japan was not only willing to surrender, but actively looking to negotiate. Their single condition was the uninterrupted reign of the imperial family and their protection from charges of war crimes. The United States absolutely knew this information. Throughout the summer, Truman received extensive intelligence about Japanese peace feelers, including a July 13th report from OSS agent Alan Dulles stating, quote, "The only condition on which Japan would insist with respect to surrender would be some consideration for the Japanese imperial family." It was the perfect opportunity for diplomacy, so why didn't we make peace? The US required an unconditional surrender, meaning there was no hospitable action towards peace feelers, nor ambassadors exchanged. It's clear that America did not drop the bomb in an effort to save lives. The possibility of diplomatic negotiations was denied months before the war ended unconditionally. The most ironic part? Japan's one condition of keeping their emperor was granted anyway. The emperor retained his position and wasn't charged as a war criminal after the surrender. At a passing glance, this might seem like a success of diplomacy, a move to sustain peace, but a closer look reveals the US made this move not out of generosity, but out of self-interest. Retaining the emperor allowed the US to gain Japan's cooperation and a foothold in Asia as we became a superpower. In 1941, 2 years after the Soviet-Japanese border war concluded, the two powers signed a neutrality pact, promising, quote, peace and friendly relations for at least 5 years. However, following agreements made during the Yalta Conference, the Soviets stated that, quote, the prolongation of that pact has become impossible, and declared war on August 9th. Hiroshiro Kawabe, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Imperial Japanese Army, is on record saying, quote, the absolute maintenance of peace in our relations with the Soviet Union is one of the fundamental conditions of continuing the war. Even after Nagasaki, the Japanese still prefer to surrender to America as less humiliating. On August 13th, Prime Minister Suzuki warned that, quote, the Soviet Union will take not only Manchuria, Korea, Harafuto, but also Hokkaido. This would destroy the foundation of Japan. We must end the war when we can deal with the United States. The importance of these dates cannot be understated. Stalin secretly agreed that the Soviet Union would not engage in war with Japan for at least 3 months after the European war ended. For Moscow, the German surrender occurred on May 9th, meaning invasion would be legal on August 9th. Americans hurried the Manhattan Project to produce a functional weapon before the 3 months were up. After so many billions had been secretly devoted, America faced a deadline. They needed to drop the bomb before the invasion, giving the appearance that Japan's now imminent surrender could only be attributed to our new powerful weapon. On August 9th, the Soviet Union promptly invaded. On the same day, the city of Nagasaki was wiped from the map by our second atomic bomb, and just 3 weeks later, the unconditional surrender that the US had hoped for was signed. The decision to target a city with negligible military power and a significant civilian population for the purposes of psychological effect should clearly be categorized as a war crime. The moment the bomb detonated, half a kilometer above the ground, more than 80,000 people's lives were instantly destroyed. They were crushed under their homes as the shockwave leveled the city, caught in the cataclysmic firestorm, or simply vaporized instantly. Tens of thousands more spent the rest of their lives living with agonizing bodily burns and radioactive cancers. The truth is, the situation did not require the bombings, even as a last resort. There was no effort put toward peaceful diplomacy. There were no demonstrations of atomic power as warnings. Simply put, the US meticulously planned the attack to have the greatest human impact possible. Before Germany fell, American intelligence envisioned our place at the end of the war in a world where two countries would emerge as superpowers. Europe and the Pacific were in ruins, but the Soviet Union and United States were clear to lead the world into the 1950s. When acknowledging the exaggerated terms and false military necessity under which the bombs were dropped, America's attempt at international intimidation becomes abundantly clear. The Manhattan Project director Leslie Groves himself said, quote, there was never from about 2 weeks from the time I took charge of this project any illusion on my part that Russia was our enemy, and the project was conducted on that basis. So when the time came to decide how the war should end, military and government leaders decided they could not let such an explosive opportunity pass. Diplomacy would never capture the world's attention like vaporizing a city. We were so eager to boast our power to destroy that we discarded any standard of building peace. It is said that war does not determine who is right, only who is left. America remained, and as the dust settled on Hiroshima, our superpower was born.